Welcome to Plano Police Department's True Crimes with Officer Bianez, a podcast dedicated to learning how criminals select their targets and what you can do to not be a victim. During each program, police officer, crime prevention specialist, and certified speaking professional Chris Bianez teams up with a safety expert to discover crime trends and how you can protect yourself. Because that's what this podcast is all about, increasing the safety for you, your family, identity, and property. It's Plano Police Department's True Crimes with Officer Bianez. Take it away, Chris.
Welcome to Plano Police True Crimes. I'm your host, Officer Chris Bianez. Joining me in the studio today is Detective Michael Maeker. He's been a law enforcement officer for over 8 years and has been with the Plano Police Department for the past 4 years. He has recently been assigned to the Juvenile Investigative Division. Detective Maeker, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Chris. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So what are we talking about today?
Well, today we're talking about two different criminal offenses that we have seen in our juvenile unit start showing up, and these are invasive visual recording and the unlawful disclosure of intimate visual material.
Okay, why would this be important for parents or for young people?
Well, there's a multitude of reasons why these are important, Chris. There's the criminal side, which is punishment, everything that goes along with that. And both of these are felony offenses, which is a pretty serious level of offense. On a more personal side, we have the social and personal life aspects of people that are victims or suspects in these crimes. For example, having your images, especially intimate visual images, transmitted out on the internet or between phones, it's very hard to reel that back in. So some of these people who are victims suffer embarrassment, can be ostracized at school or in the community, and then later down the road, further on in life, they have instances where these images come back up when they're applying for jobs or higher education. So it can have very long-term effects on people affected by these crimes. In some cases, too, we've seen that it has such a negative effect on the person who's victim that we have seen people take their own lives.
So very negative, destructive consequences.
Yes, very, very negative.
Okay, so, and these crimes are happening in Plano?
100%, yes, sir.
Okay, so can you give us an example of a true crime that's happened in Plano?
Sure, Chris. So as far as the intimate visual recording, I've had one that happened outside of school where several boys, and I won't name any names as for the purposes of this, but several boys were together at a pool, and they had been horse playing around and having fun. Well, at one point, several of the boys thought it would be a good idea to film one of the boys with his pants down. They held him, pulled down his pants, and then videotaped him. At the time, still a serious issue, but hadn't quite gotten out of hand until later down the road, those boys who had held him down and videotaped him began sending that image around to girls that he goes to school with, family members, and he suffered quite a bit of embarrassment from this, and it was reported to us. So through our investigation, we had to go and find out how it was originally recorded, how it was transmitted, and in that case, several juvenile males were charged with a felony offense. On the other side of that, for the unlawful disclosure and intimate visual recording, I've had a case in school where within a bathroom, a subject was filmed partially exposed. And so for that intimate visual recording statute, what we have is whether their breast, buttocks, genitals are exposed in that, and also where it's taken, so a bathroom or changing room can come into play. And so a person was filmed in that, and it got around to the whole school. Well, obviously the person's going to suffer embarrassment. It was again reported to us, and people can be charged with that felony offense for that.
It's clear that this would be a very disturbing offense to the parents and also affect the juveniles. And so can you tell us a little bit more about this crime, how it's committed, so we can understand it better?
Sure, Chris. So as far as the intimate visual recording, what we have is the recording or photography of a subject without their consent, where either they're partially or fully exposing their genitals, breast, buttocks, an intimate visual area. And this is done without their consent or recorded in any form within a changing room or bathroom. And so those things put together, the lack of consent, the recording of, constitutes that intimate visual recording, and that is a state jail felony. Past that, for the unlawful disclosure of intimate visual material, that's where you have an image or a recording, and that can be done with the person's consent to have that image, but then without the person's consent, you send that or share that image with a third party. Where we're seeing that is more of the revenge porn is a more common name for it. So then with holding that image without their consent, you share that to someone who was not intended to receive the image.
I know that parents are sometimes surprised to learn how young a person can be charged. What is the age of criminal responsibility in Texas?
So the beginning of the age of criminal responsibility in Texas is 10 years old. If you are 10 or older, you can be charged with a crime in Texas. And so we have seen that occur and filed charges on kids as young as 10 years old. There are caveats to that, Chris, but as far as for this intimate visual recording and unlawful disclosure, 10 on up to 17 for juvenile, and then 17 and older as an adult.
So a young person younger than 17 could find themselves behind bars in cases like this, possibly.
They can.
Okay. For those that are unfamiliar, could you briefly talk about the different penalty groups and what they mean?
Sure, Chris. So in Texas, we have different penalty groups ranging from misdemeanors to felonies. And they kind of go in a stair-step or ladder. We have the bottom, which is a Class C misdemeanor. That would be like your traffic ticket. Or for juveniles, like a curfew violation or runaway. Then it goes to B and A misdemeanors. Past that, we're getting into the felonies, which is state jail felony, 3rd degree, 2nd degree, 1st, and then capital. So what we're dealing with as far as these offenses is a state jail felony. And to be more specific on that, that can range from a pretty hefty fine to 180 days to 2 years in jail. Okay.
And it obviously can have some real negative effects, like you said, trying to get into a career. I know in law enforcement, if you're convicted of a felony, that's a permanent disqualifier, isn't it?
Correct.
So I'm sure other careers, it could negatively affect them as well.
Certainly, and we've seen that happen where your juvenile record does have some things that happen whenever you turn 17 that make it to where it can potentially not affect you as long term, but still, anything in that range can potentially keep you from getting a job. Schools look at that, colleges, and so you could potentially be denied entry into your school of choice based on juvenile offenses in some cases. And then on the other side of that, if you're the victim of these crimes, that can also get out there and affect jobs, future relationships, spouses, because if they can come and find all this information, once it's on the internet, it's effectively permanent, Chris.
Okay, so very important information. What do parents need to know?
So as far as parents, I think the important things that we'd like to stress to them, Chris, are you need to have a conversation with your kids about this, starting at a young age, because like we talked about, 10 on up, there's criminal responsibility. But kids younger and younger now are getting on social media, electronic communication, and a lot of them have their own phones, Chris. They have the ability to take photos of themselves and others. So for parents, I think they need to know that as a parent, they have the ability to go into that phone or into their child's social media. A lot don't want to cross that boundary with their child's relationship, and they want to trust their kids. And that trust is great. But if you're not taking other steps, I think you're doing your kid and yourself a disservice. In lots of these instances, the parents don't even know their kid has a Snapchat or an Instagram, which are some of these platforms we're seeing the material transmitted over. So it's important to know what your kid is viewing on social media, what their profile is. Maybe do spot checks on that from time to time, and I think that would help, especially if the kid knows that's going to happen, keep some of these at bay. So parents can get in their kids' phones. That's important. Talking to your kids about the not only criminal penalties, but also the social and educational penalties. We've seen it where these kids get so harassed and bullied at school after these events that they end up having to switch schools. In some extreme cases, move to get away from some of this because communities are small, and what are schools but an even smaller, more tightly knit community? So it has longer reaching fingers than people realize. So parents need to have those discussions, check at the social media, and then also see the trends in social media. It's hard because there's a lot of differences between our generation and maybe our kids' generation as far as what they're doing, and sometimes we don't feel like we need to get too involved in that. But knowing what they're getting, what's the trends, can be very important into having the correct conversation with your children.
Detective Maeker, what would be your advice if you were talking to young people?
So on young people, a little different approach, Chris. So at certain times, it's hard for them to understand these long-reaching effects. So I would try and break it down for them of okay, so there's this intimate visual image of you. Say it's a picture that you've taken yourself and sent somebody. How would you feel if that image got out? And for the flip side, if someone else shared your image, how would that make you feel? Because I think some of these people who are transmitting the images or recording them themselves don't realize that what they're doing has a long-term effect. They may think it's more funny. We see that a lot with the lack of forethought. So they send this image, and they don't necessarily mean for that person to have the long-lasting effects that can develop, but they do it anyway. So having them take a step back and think about how this could affect the person they're sharing might help. In some cases we see this done because of anger, Chris, and so too it's important for the victim, or potential victim in this case, to not share any intimate visual material with anybody. I know that's easier said than done, Chris, but a lot of times we see this with a juvenile relationship where they're together, things are going well, either a boy or a girl sends this image to their partner in this case. Well, statistically, these high school and middle school relationships may not last. And so at some point there may be some bad blood between those two subjects who have shared images. There's very little stopping those people from then further sharing that image. So although person one might have transmitted it to someone they consented to at the beginning, then it can get out much farther than that. And unfortunately, those bad relationships can develop, and we see that quite frequently. So not sharing any images, don't set yourself up to be a victim, is essentially what I would share with the kids.
Thank you. Good advice. And on that last example you shared, it seems like there's two things that's happened since the discussion we had. First, the person becomes a victim because now he's sending it out. But the person who sent that out, that's a violation of the law, correct?
That is a violation of the law.
So if you're in a relationship and your partner sent you this picture, then you break up, and now the person sends that picture to someone else or sends it out. That's an offense.
So that is the unlawful disclosure of intimate visual material. That's one of the aspects we see in that, Chris, where someone has willingly transmitted the first image between two people who consent, but then after that it goes to someone who did not have permission to see that footage or that photo. So that's part of that offense for the state jail felony. And also for the kids, I think it's important for them to realize how serious that is. So not only parents get brought into it, and no one wants to have their parents mad at them, Chris, but not only do you have that parental oversight where you might get grounding, other things that your parents can do to you, but then the very real criminal responsibility. And we have seen kids who have done these offenses and committed them by sending this visual material go to juvenile detention. And that can range quite differently depending on the offense, but you can stay up there for weeks, sometimes longer than that. There's fines that not only the parents may have to pay, but also the juvenile, community service, house arrest. There can be probation. And what this means is that you have to check in with a probation officer, even as a juvenile, and it really does kind of limit your freedom in your social life. So students don't realize that when they originally do these offenses, and then it comes back to bite them in a very real way. And juvenile detention is not made to be a dangerous place, but it is meant to be unpleasant. You do not want to go to juvenile detention. And so even sometimes a few days, or like you had said, hours in these juvenile detention facilities can affect the child. So it's important that we get to the point in the education where they don't end up in that situation.
Detective Maeker, final thoughts on this topic.
So final thoughts for parents, Chris, would be that I think it's very important to have conversations about this offense and others with their kids. At any age they feel appropriate, but we've talked about the age where this starts to be an issue criminally. But also it's not as much about violating their children's privacy as it is about protecting their child. And everyone wants to protect their kids and keep them safe and allow them to be happy. Well, part of that can be done by some of this monitoring of social media, monitoring their electronic communications. And we all want to trust our kids, but I think that oversight and protection can go a long way, and they don't want to underestimate the influence that they can have on their kids by having these conversations. And then as far as kids, Chris, I think that my final thought to them would be, just don't put yourself in a predicament where this could be an issue for you. Do not send any intimate visual material of any sort to even your best friends, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, because the intended recipient might not be the only person who sees that. And once it's out, Chris, it's very hard to reel back in. The internet is essentially permanent. When this image gets out there, there's not a good way to keep these images from being shared further. We cannot take these off the internet. It does not work that way. So in even Snapchat, Instagram, all these different sites, there's permanent records of everything that's transmitted between individuals through those sites. And a lot of kids don't understand that. So it doesn't just go away. But I think it's very important for kids to understand. And that if they do these crimes, Chris, there's a very high likelihood that we will investigate this and that charges can be brought.
Well, valuable information. Thank you for your time and your expertise on this.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.